Just want to welcome everybody. It's a treat to see my friend Ari Goldman from New York, and there are some other New Yorkers on the screen. It's great to be back together. There is so much to talk about in terms of Psalm 19 that I'm still sorting out which parts to emphasize. Psalm 19 is one of those psalms that is often identified with music. First, with the possibility of the music of the heavenly spheres. Hashemayim misaprim kavod el. The heavens declare the glory of God. Umaaseh yadav magid harakia. And of God's handiwork, the firmament tells. And many have heard these as the sounds of the heavens. Yom liyom yabia omer, day to day utter speech. The laila laila yechaved da'at, the night to night reveals knowledge. Now, we're going to look at this psalm with the question of what prompted this psalm and how can we find meaning personally in the psalm in our own lives. This is not, of course, the only psalm we've seen look up at the heavens and declare God's wisdom. Psalm 8 we studied together. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have established, what then is a human that you remember such a person? That Psalm 8 was the psalmist looking up apparently at the night sky. Psalm 19 is the psalmist looking up at the sun. It's a daytime psalm. The power of the order of the sun rising in the morning and moving according to a predictable path. But it's not just an ode to the movement and the regularity of creation. It's a psalm divided into three parts. Verses 1 to 7, particularly 2 to 7, looking up and seeing the wonder of creation. But then there's a shift, and it's kind of a dramatic shift, and we'll look at it. Verses 8 to 11, Torat Adonai Temima, the Torah of Adonai is perfect. And in one of my mailings this morning, I had a little YouTube of how verse 8, that turning point that goes from the majesty of the heavens to the perfection of God's teaching, from the universal to the particular, has been set to music as well, and is a hypnotic chant among the religious, repeating that line over and over. Here's something to note. In a moment, I'll read the whole psalm in English, but in the first 7 verses, the only name for God is El. El is also the Canaanite name for God. In the ancient Near East, it was the universal name for God in different Semitic languages. But beginning with verse 8, when it moves from the universal to the particular, the name of God shifts to Yud-He Vav-He, which will be repeated 7 times. 6 plus 1, which is a number of wholeness and unity. But the 1 is in the last part. It's 6 times describing God's teaching as another source of wonder, moving from creation to revelation. But verses 12 to 15 have a very different focus. And the focus of verses 12 to 15 is on an individual seeking forgiveness. Michael Fishbane, a great Bible scholar, he summarized it as follows. Nature reveals God the Creator. The Torah reveals God's will, but the prayer of the lonely soul reveals humans' presence and situation. Or as a Christian scholar, Scroggie, commented, the skies tell much, the scripture tells more, but the soul tells most of all. And so let me read in English now, this translation, and then I'll talk a little bit about the artistry, the weave of the psalm, and then return to the opening question. Who wrote this psalm and what's the goal? And I'll flag an answer. Nachum Sarna, the great Bible scholar of Brandeis University, of his translation for the Jewish Publication Society of Exodus, will say this psalm is a polemic against paganism. We'll return to that. So is it a psalm of the exuberance of looking and feeling wonder, or is there more to it? And now for the words. For the conductor, a psalm of David. The heavens declare the glory of God, and of God's handiwork the firmament tells. Day to day utters speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, there are no words, never heard is their voice. Throughout all the earth their voice extends, and to the end of the world their words. God placed in them a tent for the sun, who is like a groom coming forth from his chuppah, exulting like a hero running on course. From the end of the heavens is its rising, and its circuit reaches the other end, and nothing is hidden from its heat. The Torah of Adonai is perfect, reviving the soul. Testimony of Adonai is trustworthy, making wise the simple. The precepts of Adonai are upright, rejoicing the heart. The expectations of Adonai is clear, enlightening the eyes. The awe of Adonai is pure, abiding forever. The judgments of Adonai are truth, altogether just. More desirable than gold, than much fine gold, sweeter than honey, than drippings of the honeycomb. Indeed, your servant is careful with them, with observing them, great reward. Unwitting errors, who can discern? From hidden faults, cleanse me. Hidden, indeed, from willful sins, spare your servant, let them not rule over me. Then I will be wholehearted, and I will be cleansed from great wrongdoing. Yehi l'ratzoni mrefi ve'yon libi lefanecha, Adonai tzuri v'goli. May they be acceptable, the speech of my mouth and the meditation of my heart, before you, Adonai, my rock and my redeemer. I shifted with the 15th verse, the closing verse, into the Hebrew, because it's a verse very familiar to us who pray the Amidah regularly in Hebrew, in that these are the second to last words said whenever we do the standing prayer 3 times a day traditionally, and we walk back 3 steps with Yehi l'ratzon imrei fi, and we then bow, and then we close with Oseh Shalom bimromav. So these verse 15 are, like we've seen in many of the Psalms, kind of a summary and yet taken out of context. Let me show you how these last words are so much a closing. Here you have that 7th Yud He Vav He, and there's that plea that it be not only the words of my mouth, but even what I may not know or be able to articulate, the meditations of my heart, may they too be acceptable to you. And then we refer to God as Tzuri v'Goali, my rock and my redeemer. And both those words have a special connotation as a closing. A rock is that which is hard and fixed, in contrast to the opening, which are the movements of the sun and the celestial being, the contrast between that which is moving and distant, to the tsur, the rock, which you can climb in a military sense to get a better position. It's firm and it has clefts. It has those nooks in which you can hide. And last, as pointed out by Nachum Sarna, the word goel, the last word, here, my rock, my redeemer, emphasizing the personal nature of God, but more, a goel in the Bible is specifically a kinsman with a responsibility to redeem. So if somebody is a slave or somebody is a captive, the person who has a duty to help pay for their release is called a goel, a kinsman. In that sense, the envelope of this psalm that begins with looking up at the heavens and the sun closes with a sense of the personal, almost familial relationship with God, who is reliable, stationary, in contrast to that which moves. Some other things to note just artistically about how the psalm is composed. Look at verse 2. Hashemayim misaprim kavod el. It starts with a noun, then the verb, and then the object, right? So the heavens declare, what do they declare? The glory of God. And then it's reversed in Hebrew. It's the object, the handiwork, then the verb in the middle, and then the subject, the firmament. And so there's this sense of movement in how it's composed. Noun, verb, object, verb, noun. And then the next verb in verse in contrast is about the motion, and this is linear. Yom liyom yabia omer, day to day utter speech. Laila laila yechaved da'at, night to night reveals knowledge. And again, one is now moving in verses 4 to 5. So you go from this chiastic of 2 to the linear of 3 to now as if you can listen to the inaudible. And that's verses 4 and 5. As the voice extends, the voice from one end of the earth to the other. And then the image of seeing the sun rise like a groom coming forth from his chuppah, conveying a joy. For the psalmist and for much of the Bible, the happiest day is the day of a wedding. And each morning, and seeing the sun emerge as if from a chuppah, exalting the sun, here more kind of personification, is like a hero running on course. In the ancient world, the sun was often resting at night. But here, it's God who's created the cosmos, God who has created the space in which the sun, from which the sun emerges as it moves across the sky, and nothing is hidden from its heat. Mechamato, from its sun, from its heat. And so an ode to God's creation. Here, the sun also is not emphasized, even though it's about the sun, right? So if you look at verse 6, it's like coming like a groom from its chuppah, its canopy. But you notice that there's a downplaying of the word shemesh. It only occurs once, verse 5, though it's clearly the focus. And there, it's only in a prepositional form, la shemesh, for the sun, emphasizing it's God who creates for the sun, and downplaying the sun as an independent entity. So that's verses 1 to 7 structurally. And now the shift, Torat Adonai Timimah. Verses 8, 9, and 10 have also a distinctive structure. It's the noun of God. So the Torah of Adonai, the precepts of Adonai, the awe of Adonai, verses 8, 9, 10. And then it'll say something descriptive. The Torah is perfect. The precepts upright. The awe is pure. And then they're qualified, reviving the soul in verse 8, rejoicing the heart in verse 9, abiding forever. And so there's a structure of 3 verses, each with 2 couplets, structured the same way grammatically, but building. It's a weave. Verse 8 is the soul. It's elevated. Verse 9 is the physical, the practical. Some say 8 is vertical, 9 is horizontal, and 10 is kind of a mix of the two, with the emphasis that God's teachings are emet, truth, tzadku yachdav, altogether just. And then as a bridge, verse 11, a bridge in terms of, to an individual, what is, if you will, the materiality of worth of God's revelation. More desirable than gold and much fine gold, sweeter than honey, than drippings of the honeycomb. The word paz is in the highest level of gold, just like the drippings of the honeycomb are its sweetest part. Drippings of honeycomb are yellow, just like gold is yellow, just like the rays of the sun are yellow. You can see the link between that golden quality. And that provides a sense that what is precious, it's the teachings of God. Verse 11. And then gam, the word all, also, or indeed. And here the shift. Avdecha, your servant. In verses 12 and 14, it's repeated. Your servant. And 2 different kinds of wrongs. 13 are shkiot. There's, beshogeg and bemazid in rabbinic writings. 2 kinds of wrongdoings for which we atone on high holidays. Those done unwittingly, unknowingly, those are shkiot. And bemazid are done intentionally. And here in verse 14, al yimshalu vi, don't let them rule over me, which means that these wrongdoings, intentional wrongdoings, are seductive. The psalmist is acknowledging his own vulnerability to be drawn to these temptations. Some interpret, instead of willful sins, zadim, as the arrogant, so that it's people who are arrogant that are seducing him. Back to Hebrew, and this being my chosen translation, it can be understood in translations either way, sometimes vague and simultaneously true. And so now the question, what's prompting this psalm and how is it relevant to us? The beginning, as I noted, is famous for Hashemayim Mesaprim Kavod El, the heavens declare the glory of God, put to music by Bach, put to music by Haydn, put to music by many liturgically, because they raise our eyes heavenward to see the magnificence of creation. And so, is this an ode of awe prompted by sunrise? Possibly. But here's the other understanding. And Nachum Sarna has a book called On the Book of Psalms. He only analyzes about 7 psalms, and he has about 30 pages on this psalm, which he says is a polemic. And so let me start with what the nature is of that polemic. In the ancient world, in Mesopotamia, Babylonia, Syria, that whole region, there was a belief at different times in the sun as God, called Shamash, not unlike the Hebrew word Shemesh for sun. that ancient belief goes back a very long way. As early as 1870, before the Common Era, we have writings of Shamash, who takes himself to his chamber, who has a bride, who's a hero warrior, who traverses the ways of heavens, and who's responsible for cosmic justice. In Hammurabi's code, which is 1728 to 1686, King Hammurabi, he will have reference to Shamash as the supervisor of the moral order in both his prologue and his epilogue. And it's not just in Mesopotamia. The Egyptians would say, in some cases, that with Akhenaten's worship of Ra, it's the first introduction of monotheism. And of Ra, the sun god, we likewise read of Hail as he traverses the way of heaven, the valiant one, great runner, swift of step. And his daughter, Ma'at, will be identified with order, stability, and truth. And that translates into Greek writings, where Apollo is likewise the god of sun and simultaneously the supervisor of law and order and source of legislation. So there's this archetype of the sun enabling life, being predictable, and on which we are fully dependent, and therefore leading to worship. Jacob Milgram once gave a talk in our synagogue years ago, and here's what he focused in on. Here's the Jewish response. He said the creation story itself, the sun and moon are not put into the sky until the fourth day, and then they're never called by their formal names, sun and moon. Instead, they're called the great light and the smaller light. Hama'or hagadol l'mamshelet hayom, the great light to rule over day, vet the ma'or hakaton, and the smaller light to rule over night and over the stars. Chapter 1, verse 10. And he said, why in our creation story are the sun and moon not created on day 1? Why day 4? And why never named? Because he, a modern Bible scholar, said our Hebrew creation story is a polemic against sun worship. And the rabbi and the Torah will continue. Deuteronomy 4:19 will say, you shall not worship the moon, do not bow and worship the sun or moon or celestial object. And chapter 17 of Deuteronomy 3-5 will make it a capital offense. When King Josiah comes after his father, King Manasseh, in the 7th century before the Common Era, in front of the temple, King Josiah will remove the horses that were dedicated to the sun at the entrance of the temple. And in fact, in the Mishnah, now going later, there's a description of the great celebration of Sukkot, the Beit Sho'avah, the water celebration. And it says in 5:4 of Sukkot that the worshipers of the gate turned from the east to the west to face the temple and proclaimed, our ancestors worshiped the sun toward the east, but as for us, our eyes are turned to the Lord. And so there is throughout the Bible, and it reaches into rabbinic periods of the 2nd century of the Common Era, still popular with Apollo in Greece and Rome, the sense that our God is the creator God. The sun and the moon are not worthy of being worshiped. They serve the creator. And in this psalm, Psalm 19, again, the sun is only mentioned once, although it's about the movement of the sun. And that's verse 5, Lashemesh, where it's for the sun that God created the order, the canopy, which leads to God as moral leader And for Sarna, that's part of the archetype of the worship of the sun god. But here, I'll shift. It's more understood as the nature of God is not just the God out there who created, but is a moral God who gave us teachings to revive our souls. Meshivat nafesh. Nafesh, again, is the spirit placed within us of God. And that leads to the third section of Avdecha, your servant. I want to say that this psalm was for the Vilna Gaon, the great teacher of Lithuania, the psalm for Shavuot coming up, in that it emphasizes the goodness of Torah, that's that middle section, and is a psalm that's been put to music again in many ways. I'll add, it's also part of the Rastafarian song, The Rivers of Babylon, will have 19 verse 14 included. But I want to conclude with one last piece, and I'm now down to only a few minutes. Tomorrow, I will make sure for Psalm 20 we have some discussion time. But here's a separate bar that I find interesting. One of my friends in Israel, on her Facebook page 2 days ago, quoted Maimonides in a way that I needed to revisit, which is quoting, as she quoted it, from Mishnah Torah, Yesodei Torah, the 3rd chapter, 9th paragraph. Every star has a soul and is endowed with knowledge and intelligence. They are living beings who apprehend God who spoke and the world was. And as they apprehend God, so they are conscious of themselves and of the angels above them. So I was surprised to see this quote to say that Maimonides attributed a soul and intelligence to the heavenly beings. And I saw in researching it this morning that it's also quoted in the Guide for the Perplexed, and that's in volume 2, verse 4. And interestingly, those words are in quotation marks attributed to Aristotle, which is fascinating to me because Maimonides was somebody opposed to astrology, uniquely in the Middle Ages, but he was still taken by the wisdom of the Greeks. And so that got included in both his Mishnah Torah and in quotation marks quoting Aristotle. And Pythagoras felt or taught that as a matter of science, that the revolutions of the heavens created a sound that was inaudible, but was indeed a symphony of different sounds depending on the size of the orbit moving around a center. But for him, that was science. To pull Psalm 19 together for today, this is a spiritual journey, a journey that begins with pausing to acknowledge the order of creation, that the sun rises and moves with power through the sky, but is not to be worshiped. It is, and that's the key religious message, that even the stars and the sun are products of a creator, but a particular kind of creator, a creator that also is a teacher of morality, a morality that enables us to know how to elevate our lives, and last, a creator with whom there can be a personal relationship, avdecha. One can and is called to serve and then can address God directly. Your servant, God. So that last verses are addressing God directly. And with that last verse of 15, while the Amida is in the plural, it opens with a quote from Psalms and it closes with Psalm 19, verse 15, which is, may they, my words, be acceptable, the speech of my mouth, the meditation of my heart, before you, Adonai, my rock, my redeemer. The word my is repeated 4 times, and the emphasis is on you. on an intimacy of relationship. Only 15 verses. It's quite a journey from the movement of the heavenly Son to the individual seeking wholeness before God. Tomorrow, we'll be looking at Psalm 20, and here the last verse is translated in two very different ways, and I'll promote it by saying, save the king, that expression, God save the king, which is said about the English monarch, is the way that the Vulgate translates the last verse, which is the Latin translation, which is the standard text for the Roman Catholic Church. And it's understood very differently in the normative rabbinic translation in terms of its, you will see. We'll hold that back. Thank you all for coming and joining me. And that we have close to 30 today is a great source of joy from coast to coast. And thank you for enabling me to learn Psalms with you. And tomorrow, hope to see you again, Psalm 20. Have a good day.